I need a little help with that, especially today. Gary, thank you for that beautiful, beautiful music. Those pieces were just lovely. And I understand that last piece was called A Little Prayer. And we are a people of prayer, for sure. So thank you so much for leading us in that way. And to Kay, too, for the musical leadership you've given this morning. Well, Naomi, I identified a little bit with that part in your prayer that said broken in body. Thank you. It took on new meaning for me this week. I broke a little bone in my hand. So hopefully things are on the mend, but you just never know what your week's going to hold. And it wasn't what I anticipated, but it's okay. Well, you might imagine what a thrill it was to anticipate a visit to Bethlehem. And I mean the real Bethlehem, only 12 days before Christmas. Some years ago, our group of denominational leadership was scheduled to visit Manger Square, the Church of the Nativity, and Bethlehem College on our visit to the Holy Lands. We began the first day's tour in the offices of Bethlehem Bible College. And as we entered the building in that faraway land, something very familiar caught our eye. Right there on a filing cabinet was the bumper sticker. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies," I think he probably meant, "Don't kill them." It was taken from the lyrics of a song that was written by Church of the Brethren school teacher Linda Williams, who lives in San Diego, California, right there in the real Bethlehem. Well, we learned that even, and maybe especially, the Bible College in Bethlehem was deeply affected by the continuing conflict and the relentless oppression in that war-torn land. Our group had the honor of an invitation to lunch with the college president, where he shared personally with us. He spoke of efforts of intimidation and bullying by the government and military, and of the violence that is theirs every day. I asked him if he ever felt that his personal safety was directly at issue, and he said, all the time. This courageous and faith-filled man was risking his very life every day to live his beliefs, to continue to the work which he had been called. Yet he was confronting the enemy peacefully as he persisted in that calling. He was living out the message of the bumper sticker in the front office, and I've often wondered since then how often that message gave him the courage and the resolve to go on when other courses of action must have seemed more intuitive. So when we were planning this sermon series on building peace and coming at it from a variety of angles, I remembered this bumper sticker and the instruction to love our enemies. And I found this passage of scripture from the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of God in heaven. Well, different Christian traditions understand this teaching of Jesus and the whole of the Sermon Mount in Matthew 5 in a variety of ways. Some think that Jesus was putting forth a set of values to which his disciples, and that includes us, should aspire. They are impossible, but that's the point. By striving toward them, we live better than we would otherwise. Others think that Jesus' words throughout the Sermon on the Mount reveal the impossibility of human righteousness, preparing us for the advent of grace. Still others believe that Jesus was speaking to his disciples as individuals. In our modern world, with its complex relationships, global economics, and violent military threats, his advice simply does not hold. For these folks, Jesus' teaching is irrelevant. And yet others propose that Jesus never intended for these sayings to be reasonable because they violate the common sense of this world and rather point to the reality of the next. And some scholars offer yet another understanding, one that resonates with our tradition, and I think resonates with us. One leading scholar argues, though clever and insightful, all of these interpretations suffer the same problem. Matthew's gospel as a whole, and the Sermon on the Mount in particular, repeatedly insist that Jesus means exactly what he says. In Matthew's gospel, to follow Jesus means to do what Jesus says. But it can also leave us scratching our heads and wondering, if we take Jesus' teaching on nonviolence seriously, what does that, practically speaking, look like? In these days of the Taliban and Boko Haram and ISIS and ongoing violence, even in the little town of Bethlehem, how can we love our enemies? How can we be followers of Jesus if that's exactly what Jesus meant? Preparation for this sermon took me back some 20 years to a seminary class, a cooperative effort of Eastern Mennonite Seminary and our own Bethany Theological Seminary. The course? Issues in Faith and Peacemaking. And it's just what I needed as a brand new brethren. It was co-taught by two dynamic professors. Mennonite John Lapp, who had recently retired as executive secretary to the Mennonite Central Committee, and a Church of the Brethren professor, none other than our own Dale Brown, retired Bethany faculty and a member of this congregation at the time. The passion that these two retired men exuded for peacemaking was contagious. So I'd like to share some of what our class learned, much from the writings of Walter Wink. It may be new to some. It was to me. It helped me to see and to embrace peacemaking in a whole new way. And I'm inspired whenever I revisit it, which I try to do often. Throughout the ages, humanity has understood two responses to evil: flight or fight. And when issues become polarized, whether it's personal or global, it seems that these two are the two options. Flight or passivism is to give into, or to resign to the oppression or the evil, to flee. Fight, of course, is when physical violence is used in return, whether it's fighting at a personal level or that global level. Walter Wink proposes a third way: stay engaged, but refuse to oppose evil on its own terms. He says that these verses in Matthew, Jesus was urging his followers to transcend both passivity and violence by finding that third way, one that is both assertive yet nonviolent. It's what we call nonviolent resistance. And it's interesting that Wink draws heavily from Martin Luther King Jr. on his philosophy. King draws heavily from Gandhi and the Gandhian theory of peacemaking, and Gandhi credits the life and the teachings of Jesus, especially the Sermon on the Mount, as most instructive and inspirational. Each of these men lived out this theory in nonviolent resistance, a third way, in their own context. King, as exemplified by the Selma to Montgomery marches against racial injustice, Gandhi in his Salt March to the Sea in response to the oppressive British rule. And the examples that Jesus provided support this understanding. Until recent years, much of Christendom saw the teachings of Jesus and his examples as passive. Turn the other cheek implied a doormat kind of non-response that made peace-seeking Christians seem cowardly, even complicit in the face of evil. Give also your cloak seemed to disempower all opposition to evil and to encourage submission. And going the second mile had become a platitude, meaning nothing more than encouraging collaboration with the oppressors. If we understand Jesus' teachings this way, they appear impractical and potentially self-harming, with an open invitation to bullies and oppressors and abusers and more. Wink offers a few words of explanation on how this understanding of this passage came to be. 5th century theologian Augustine was highly influential in the development of Western Christianity. He believed and taught widely that the gospel teaches non-resistance, not to be confused with non-violence. And therefore, a true follower of Jesus would not resist, even attempt self-defense. To compound that understanding, centuries later, when the Bible was first translated into English, King James didn't want anyone to think that they had recourse against his army or any other army. His orders clearly would have influenced the nuances with which the translators chose their words. So the teaching of the church across the centuries and tradition has certainly colored the way that this teaching of Jesus on nonviolence has been understood. According to Wink, Jesus never displayed that kind of passivity. Jesus counseled resistance, but without violence. Jesus articulated a way by which evil can be opposed without being mirrored, the oppressor can be resisted without being emulated, and the enemy neutralized without being destroyed. When turning the other cheek, giving a cloak, and going the second mile are studied in the context of the law and social customs of Jesus' day, they take on quite a different meaning. Not at all about passivity, but all about non-violent resistance, pointing us to a new way of confronting evil, whose potential for personal and social transformation we are only beginning to grasp. It calls for a posture rooted in profound resistance and unexpected refusal to play the opponent's adversarial game. Not flight, not fight, but a third way, that of nonviolent resistance. And what about that culminating instruction to love your enemies? In the original language, this love is agape love and indicates neither a romantic love nor a warm, fuzzy, good-feeling love. It has nothing to do with liking someone or liking something. Rather than a feeling, it indicates something of the will, a decision. It's about understanding creative, redemptive goodwill for all people. It's what many would call the love of God working in the lives of people, and that offers to hold open the possibility of the enemies becoming just. It is the hope and promise that no one is beyond the scope of God's transforming love. And I think that that is what Jesus meant by loving our enemies. He set up this command to love the enemy with radical and audacious, non-violent resistance in turning the cheek and giving the cloak and going the extra mile. And love, the agape love of God, is extended to the enemy through resistance, thwarting the cycle of violence and offering hope for a better and a peaceful way for all. The idea of nonviolent resistance was a fairly new idea to most of our class, and it took a lot of discussion, debate, and time to let it soak in, to ask questions, to begin to imagine the possibilities. One of the questions that was raised was about the possible value or effectiveness of nonviolent resistance in the case of great evil such as Hitler and Nazi Germany. Some classmates questioned how loving the enemy would or even could have stopped the incredible evil. Although an overarching strategy of resistance was lacking, there were several successful acts of nonviolent resistance, several pockets where the third way was most effective. Consider this true story. It all started one cold, dark evening during the winter of 1940 with a knock at the door of André Trocmé of Le Chambon, France. He answered the door, and there stood a hungry, cold woman, a Jewish refugee fleeing the Nazis. A simple act of kindness became a beacon of hope for thousands of people fleeing the Vichy government, conspirators with the Nazi regime. 5,000 refugees were saved, housed in private homes, on farms, and in public institutions. They hid in the countryside whenever the Nazis came through, and one of the villagers later recalled, "As soon as the soldiers left, we would go into the forest and we would sing a song. When they heard the song, the Jews knew that it was safe to come out. The locals welcomed and sheltered them, even educated their children, and some arranged for many to escape to safety in Switzerland or Spain via a well-organized underground network." Consider these other pockets of nonviolent resistance as well. Bulgaria's Orthodox Bishop Kirill told Nazi authorities that if they attempted to deport Bulgarian Jews to concentration camps, he himself would lead a campaign of civil disobedience, one of nonviolent resistance, lying down on the railroad tracks in front of the trains. Thousands of Bulgarians, Jews and non-Jews, resisted all collaboration with the Nazis, and it is thought that because of these and other non-military measures, all of Bulgaria's Jewish citizens were saved from the death camps. Nonviolent resistance made a difference, and it worked. Perhaps if there had been more pockets of peacemakers and they could have joined efforts, the outcome might have been different. There's no guarantee. Nothing is certain, even with the most faithful of intentions. Each situation takes the creativity and wisdom of God's Spirit and the community together, discerning ways that make for peace and a willingness to engage in nonviolent resistance. My imagination has often returned to the 2014 annual conference that was held in Columbus, Ohio. Cliff Kindy, kind of our brethren activist, brought a proposal to the delegate body. It was to offer 200 and some of ourselves in exchange for the abducted Chibok girls held in captivity by the Boko Haram in Nigeria. Would such an exchange have worked? Maybe, maybe not. Was it dangerous? No doubt. Was it a third way? For sure. Was it loving the enemy? Absolutely, as it allowed space for the possibility of transformation for all. Would I have participated if given the opportunity, volunteering to be one of the 200 and plus? I'm not sure. What I do know is that too often I've done the safe thing, and I wonder if I'm ready now to do a faithful thing, like Andre Trocmé, like Bishop Kivil, like King and Gandhi, like Jesus. I hope so. That's why we remind ourselves each week that we are committed to practicing peace. That's who we are. We are called to exercise and strengthen our peace muscles so they don't become flabby and sloppy. And we join with our sisters and brothers around the world who are doing the same, so that we are ready and prepared to turn the cheek, to give the cloak, and go the extra mile, and to love our enemies. That's the third way, the Jesus way. And as peacemakers, we participate in building a new world, empowered by God's Spirit, where all shall be God's people in justice, love, and peace.